Hello, I'm Bruce Lorincz, and this show is called Bruce on the Loose. I go ahead and talk to people in the school system, city government, and businesses now. We're pleased today to have Tom Morris, the law director of the City of Wadsworth. Tom, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us.
Thank you for having me, Bruce.
What about your educational background? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I graduated from Wadsworth High School in 1991. After graduating, then I decided to go to Miami University and study paper science engineering. That was not as sexy as it sounds. So about halfway through, I decided maybe I don't want to devote my life to something I didn't like. My dad thought that he didn't want to pay for an education that didn't get me a job afterwards, so we settled on economics. And then I took the standardized test for the law school. That's called the LSAT. I did well enough on there where I got into University of Michigan, I got into Ohio State, and I asked my father, it's going to be a real Big Ten showdown here,
Sure.
whether I decide which one to go to. And he said, well, didn't you get accepted to Akron? I said, yeah, they gave me a full ride. Isn't that weird? And he said, well, that makes it easy for you. And that's where we ended up with at Akron, so I didn't have to pay for it.
What was law school like?
Law school is interesting because you think that they're going to teach you what the laws are in law school, and that is absolutely not what they teach you. They go forward with what's called the Socratic method, where they try to ask you questions so that you figure it out yourself. And then you realize once you're out of law school, there's no more Socratic method. People don't want to talk it out as to what the law is. They want answers as to what they can and cannot do. So it's a little bit of a shift, but they're trying to allow you to learn how to figure out things, think like a lawyer is what they would often say. So at the conclusion of those 3 years, then you take the bar exam.
Very stressful for a lot of people, especially the length of it and the pressure you sometimes put on yourself.
We're talking about law school or
Yes.
the bar or both? Yeah.
Yes, the bar.
The bar is 3 days. I think they've changed it, but when I took it, it was 3 days. Half day was multiple guests, and then they go right into blue booking it, which is they give you these blue books and they say just fill them out. I know when I was sitting for the bar, it's a giant room. There's a table. There was 2 of us on there. And I start filling out the book. The guy ahead of me, or the guy I shared the table with, did one session and then I disappeared. Thought he was going to the bathroom. Never saw him again. So for him, it was a little too much stress. He didn't show up again. But fortunately, I was able to pass him the first time.
What other positions have you held prior to coming back to Wadsworth?
After law school, or while I was in law school, I started, well, if I'm going to be a lawyer, I should probably figure out what that means, since they're not teaching me the law in law school. So I started my second year in law school working at the Wadsworth Municipal Court. Hey, that makes sense, right? I want to see what lawyers do. I want to get that experience. So Judge Kimbler was there at the time, and I was going to go in and watch what probation department did. Right when I got there is when the judge's bailiff had a baby and she wasn't coming back anymore. So he needed somebody to deliver subpoenas. So I cut a deal with Judge Kimbler. I said, you let me watch as much trials as I want, talk to the jurors, talk to the litigants, talk to the judge about what was going on, then I'll deliver subpoenas for him. So I did that and just sat there and watched as many trials as I could. Now, Wadsworth's a small town. And so when Judge Kimbler went up to Common Pleas Court, Judge McIlvaine took over for Judge Kimbler, and then the firm, Palisek, McIlvaine, Hoffman, and Morris, needed an associate that could practice in that court. Jim McIlvaine couldn't practice in front of his brother. Andy McIlvaine couldn't practice in front of his uncle, so that was me. I went in to practice in front of the Wadsworth Municipal Court. So I stayed there for 17 years, made partner with the firm. But in order to be good at something, you've got to spend time doing it. And I wanted to be good at trials. You only get a couple jury trials a year if you're busy in private practice. The only place to do that was a prosecutor. The opportunity arose about 7-8 years ago where the prosecutor who had been prosecutor for 20-some years retired. That was Paige Schrock. So I took over for Paige as doing all the trial work in the Wadsworth Municipal Court. So, except for a few jurisdictions. That meant I was doing 600 cases a year where you could actually physically go in and try the cases and work on your chops and work on every part of it. So I did that, and then once again, opportunity arose. Mr. Bragg retired. Norman Bragg retired after 46 years as the law director. And when he retired, the one part I didn't know about was how to run a governmental agency. So I was able to do that by running the law department.
Sounds like you had some very fine mentors along the way to help and assist you to kind of see the light.
Everybody does, and if they don't, they say they all did it themselves, they're lying. And I was blessed being in the right place at the right time, and then having a few people who took the time to show me how to be a lawyer, how to do it right. Judge Kimbler was the first one I worked for. Was an excellent jurist, or is an excellent jurist still. Then it was Jim McIlvaine and Steve McIlvaine. Both helped me immensely. Steve McIlvaine has helped me as a lawyer and practicing in front of him for all that time. And then Norman Bragg. He is a wealth of knowledge for doing it for 26 years or 46 years, and certainly helped me continue his legacy as the law director.
How long have you been the law director for the city of Wadsworth?
I was elected in 2000, so I've been for about 3 years now. I was the assistant when I was the prosecutor, but as the full-time law director.
Does it get easier with the tenure? You kind of anticipate things before they happen?
You know the answer before having to look it up. Yeah, it gets a little bit easier as the time goes. You start to see repetitive questions, so you know how you're going to deal with it. You know if you do it one way, this is what happens. If you do it another way, this is what happens. But for us, or for me at least, it was a difficult situation, but I didn't know how difficult was it, because when I started, then COVID hit. And then COVID completely changed what the law director did for a period of time. So that allowed me to start something new, so I could get everything taken care of as best I could, and then move on from there, getting back to doing what law directors do.
Sometimes with that COVID, it really backs things up. And I know my daughter practices law out in Washington, and she had a caseload of over 80 cases, and it was very difficult to get back in the swing of things.
Well, certainly one of the places that did not close is the Medina County Jail over COVID. We can't close that down. The laws were, all still in effect in COVID, but what was happening was you were getting a lot fewer DUIs. People weren't driving, bars were closed, they weren't out there. But now they're at home, so you get a lot more domestic violences. And domestic violences, by law, you have to arrest if you can find the person who is the primary aggressor. So now we have to have a system, because we've got a skeleton crew at the court. We've got people in the jail that they're trying to prevent COVID. We have to have a procedure for setting forth so we don't get, if it ran rampant in the jail, that's a real problem. So I had to work with Terry Grice, and we had to work with Cassie Fry at the court to try to get a procedure for how we're going to go do this. And so that was a very interesting and challenging part right when I was starting.
What about 3 or 4 your main responsibilities? I know you have probably a multitude of things that are on your plate each and every week, but maybe hone it down for us for about 3 or 4 main responsibilities.
By statute, there's 2 main ones. One is I have to prosecute all the cases out of the city of Wadsworth for criminal cases and traffic offenses, and I have to prosecute all the cases for the townships in the southern part of the jurisdiction of the Wadsworth Municipal Court. So we've got a criminal docket, and the docket's around 600 cases. But we're also tasked with representing the institutions of the city of Wadsworth in a civil capacity. Now, Bruce, we're a $110 million corporation. Other $110 million corporations have entire floors of lawyers that are working for them. We don't. We try to keep it lean and try to do as much as we can in-house, but we do have to hire some out on occasion. But what we do in the criminal cases is what you think of as a prosecutor. In civil, we're doing everything from writing the legislation or the ordinances. We are making sure that those are followed by the rules of Robert's Rules of Order. We're doing all questions that they have regarding zoning issues, how we can comply with different statutes for prevailing wage, for all of those legal issues that a corporation would have of our size, we also have.
What impact do the county, state, and federal laws have on the city of Wadsworth, and you in particular?
We're tasked to know all of those. Ignorance is not an excuse for the law, right? So it goes from bidding requirements. When do we have to bid this out? The cities work slow, and that's not because they're lazy or even overworked. It's because they have to, because this isn't our money. This is the citizens' money. So we make additional requirements on those citizens or on those city officials to bid out to make sure that we're not transferring property where we shouldn't, make sure everybody's got a safe, make sure everybody's got it fair. So we're doing all of those things which slow us down. And plus we've got a council that meets every other week, so that slows it down. We're not making immediate decisions on every issue. So those laws affect us. Whether there are requirements for prevailing wage affects us, whether there's requirements for how the case law is dealing with force majeure, and that is when there's pandemics, how did that affect us? So all those issues are all kind of jump up against Freedom of Information Act requests. We've seen a couple of those today. All of those things are statutorily based, and they affect us.
How much do you interact with the mayor and city council?
I interact with them a lot. Once again, I represent not them personally, but I represent the entity of the mayor. I represent the entity of city council. So I deal with them having questions about what can we do, what we can't do. I deal with council and I want to write this legislation which does X and Y. How do I do that? How do I effectuate that? What problems would I have if we tried to make this illegal or do that? Those are issues that would come to me. Can we give raises beyond this point? That's federal law that we have to deal with. So I deal with them all as need be, trying to stay at arm's length as best I can, because I don't work for any of them. I'm an elected official, and try to give advice so we can go forward and make decisions that are within the bounds of the law.
Your term in your office, 4 years?
We have
Is
a
that
4-year
right?
term
Okay.
for the law director, yes.
Okay. There was an issue I read last week in the Post about a resident feeding animals that maybe cause a nuisance, I guess I could say politely. What is your role with that?
Talking to skunks,
Yes.
and the question is whether or not there is an ordinance, or could there be an ordinance which would preclude somebody from feeding skunks. There's not a state ordinance, there's not a state law that says you can't do that, but citizens or the local ordinances or local municipalities can pass laws. Some do. Medina's passed it, Brunswick's passed it, some others have passed it. So then the question is, how do you do one that makes sense, that's not too broad, and it's not too narrow so as to not catch anybody, too broad as to catch everybody. So if you say something like, it's illegal to feed animals. Okay, now what about the bird feeder that you have out there that your nephew made for you in the Boy Scouts? Well, we don't want to make that illegal. Okay, so now you got to pack it back. Now we want to make only skunks illegal, feeding skunks. Well, how do we enforce that when there is some food out back and I was feeding my dog, or I was feeding something else that was legal? So we don't like to have laws in the books that aren't enforceable, that just sit there. That doesn't make sense. So what we're trying to do is draft a common sense approach to dealing with the skunk issue, and letting people use their property within the bounds, but not in such a way as it affects everybody in the neighborhood. They have a right to use their property as well.
So you're basically saying it's not an easy issue. There are really a lot of facets to ordinances the city and council must look at and pass, and that maybe is good that they take their time.
Yeah, there's a lot of different issues on it, and that's why they have me write it. So it's not really fair. We have ordinary citizens. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a lawmaker, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to some people, because they're asked to do something and they don't have the ability, or they may have the ability, but they don't have the training to look for these problems. So you could pass a law that says, okay, you have to shovel your driveway. Okay, great. That law is out there. Well, does that mean you have to shovel it when the first snowflake hits? Probably not. Do you have to wait till the snow event ends? Maybe. And there's a bunch of different aspects to it that make it more complex. We had a gentleman that was camping in the front of Walmart, or not Walmart, in front of Home Depot, or the Target area, and they said, well, that's not safe. That's not something good. So then we had to draft legislation, or I drafted legislation that would make it illegal to camp in the public right of way. That legislation is probably a page and a half, because I had to make sure I did a bunch of different things. I had to make sure it was illegal to do what was unsafe. We have that right to do that. But I can't make it illegal to be homeless. That's not right either. So there had to be certain things that were written into that law, which made it a little more difficult. But that law was passed through the Court of Appeals. They said that was constitutional, and I think everywhere this guy has gone, they've also passed that law, kind of following through the state of Ohio.
Sometimes you deal with county officials. With the Santee Landing, that was just the grand opening just about a month ago, and do you have a role with and of course the Medina County Metropolitan Housing Authority has the towers and a couple other facilities, Menwa, I think, in the city. So we've dealt with them before. Do you have a role with that at all?
Not directly, but indirectly. Certainly, I've talked to their lawyer multiple times for different issues they have with dealing with some of the people, whether they can restrict people's access to it. I had a discussion with their attorney just recently on that. But as for the building, that was pretty clean. Nobody comes to me with good news, Bruce. They come to me with problems that they said, well, is this illegal? Is that illegal? Is this a problem or not? So that was relatively clean, that last thing that went up, at least from our standpoint. The one issue we had with the drug treatment house, just an example of something we had to do some research on, was whether or not you could restrict people's access when they're a protected class. These were recovering drug addicts or drug dependents, and they had some protections under federal law. So it was me trying to explain you cannot restrict them or zone them out simply because who they are. So that was something that may not have been obvious, that had to do a little research for and make sure everybody knew what the law was.
What about the new fire station on College? I went by the other day and they're starting to get some of the walls up and making tremendous progress. The weather broke this week a little bit for them. What if the contractor failed to go ahead and deliver when expected? They said there was supply issues, or they didn't have the manpower that they were promised. Do you have any role or situation with that?
You haven't heard anything that I don't know about.
No. I don't want to make your day worse than it might be.
No, that's a good question. There's certain issues, and I mentioned force majeure. That was a topic that we had in law school. That was one of those things where I thought, okay, when am I ever going to use this? And that is act of God. And that says we can delay certain things if there was an act of God. There's a hurricane that hit, which destroyed all the critical stuff, so we can't provide it. So I thought, I'm never going to use this. Boy, have I used this. That is a global pandemic which has ruined supply chains all the way up and down, which has delayed a lot of things, has changed prices of a lot of things. So we've dealt with that on a contract side. But the fire station is an interesting way we're doing this, and we've never done this in the past that I know of. This was a CMAR, a construction manager at risk contract, which means instead of us hiring a general and then subbing out all of the people and bringing in all these other people to do this, and then we're relying on this person at this time, and then the price changes. We're hiring one person, one neck to ring, so to speak, and this one person says, we're going to build it, and we're going to build it for this price. So we have that person in place, and they are the ones that are in charge of making sure it's timely, making sure it's done for one price, because they've guaranteed what the maximum price is. So that's an interesting way we're doing it to try to keep costs down, and it's working great so far. So I've been real impressed with how it's been done so far. We
talked to Captain Ashley of the group down south of Salvation Army, and they have a new building they're working on. And you mentioned cost overruns. They said that because of the interest rates going up and some other things, the cost of that facility went up $300,000. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't. It's just... It's, hey, back to my econ degree, right? It's supply and demand. Right now, the supply went way down, which costs go way up. We looked at everything from the cost overruns on the roundabout. Just wasn't people squeezing us. It was actual costs that have gone up. So that's one of those things where we recognize we're in a different world. And we can't assume everything. We can't foresee everything. Things happen, and you just got to deal with it.
I'll give you a compliment. The roundabout really works well. We went through there a couple times on the way to Medina, and it really traffic seems to flow much better. And whosever idea it was, the engineering department probably, they have kudos from Lorincz family, and it really has worked out very well.
We really should charge admission because Wadsworth citizens are just driving around there just to do it. I know my mom's been around 5 times and she doesn't have to. But yeah, it really has worked out well. And what I've always told people is, I don't know if roundabouts work or not, but the people that do know are the ones that study it for 4 years in college for traffic studies, and they all love them. So I was happy they gave it a try, and it does seem to be working out real nice.
You seem to have some interaction with the schools too. The new 5th and 6th grade building is going to be put up off of Broad Street, although the front of it faces toward School Drive, toward the high school. Was there any consideration, did anything cross your desk about traffic flow? I know some people have mentioned it may be a little dicey in the morning when people are trying to get to work from Silver Creek and other places. Did anything, you had anything across your desk on that regard?
Not yet. We're just not there yet. There's going to be traffic studies that are going to be done. It's going to go through engineering. We have an in-house engineering department that does a wonderful job in Wadsworth, so they'll be going through that. Now, if there comes to the point where there's a conflict between the two, then they may involve me. It's a weird part of the law, but technically, the city law department also represents the schools. So at some point, Dr. Hill could call me and ask for legal advice. Certainly wouldn't be something like that, though, because if we're in direct conflict, then I have to defer to the city of Wadsworth as a primary client.
What about, do DUIs give you a lot of trepidation and they're very difficult to go ahead and prove?
We've had a lot of great success with DUIs, and that all comes from training from the start with the officers. One of the things that I've taken some special interest in is they're called, not driving under the influence of alcohol, but it's not just alcohol. Right. It could be pain pills, it could be marijuana, it could be heroin. So these drug recognition experts we have a couple of them here in Wadsworth, and I took an interest in that, and we've tried 7 or 8 of those cases that they're not under the influence of alcohol, but they have had too many pills, they've had too much marijuana, they've had too much whatever. So we've had a lot of success with those type of cases, and it's kind of a new thing in the state of Ohio.
How do you go ahead and try to select a jury? I think that's sometimes very difficult, and you know that they are paying attention, they're nodding, and sometimes you don't get the verdict you surmise.
Yeah, it's all vibe check is what I tell my kids, just to get the vibe off them. I'll tell you a story. I was trying a case, and there was a woman there that I just didn't. It was involving a sale for a commission for a real estate company, and I said, it's not passing the vibe check. So I asked her to leave, or I thanked her and said she was excused. And then she called my office later that night and said, "Why'd you kick me off? I would have gave you anything you wanted. I hate those other people." That's part of the job as doing it. And probably she shouldn't have been on the jury if she had already made up her mind, even if it was for our side. But yeah, jury, that is more of an art than a science. It is talking to people, making sure they understand the concepts that you are trying to get at. You're thinking about how you could lose the case and making sure that they understand or are on board with following the law as it's presented for them. So that's my favorite part of the jury trials, are talking to the jurors.
Maybe we have a neighbor that isn't getting their grass cut and is starting to have weeds, and maybe they even have a car parked in the front yard. How can you motivate them to take care of their property?
Well, it starts with a call to the city where they say there's a complaint because it's overgrown. Typically, we've seen it. We drive around the city all the time too. And they'll get a letter saying, hey, please comport to what you need to do. Once they fail to do that, then it gets involved with the courts where we can actually bring a charge in front of Judge McIlvaine, and the judge can do things other than ask nicely to get people to comport with what they're doing on their property. Hey, we live in a society where you should be allowed to have some free reign over your property. I get that. But at some point, you're a blight to the city, and you're bringing down everybody's property values. They got a right as well. So we try to make sure people keep up with what they're required to do under the law.
And that car, you also could motivate people to move that car or to sell it or whatever.
Yeah, not as fast as I would like to. But yeah, if they do have a bunch of cars on there that are unregistered and are just kind of sitting back there, these nowhere in the city of Wadsworth is zoned a junkyard, so we don't want junk cars to do that.
Tom Morris, I learned a great deal today, and I hope the viewers did as well. Thank you very much for taking time, your busy schedule, to join us, and thank you for viewing Bruce on the Loose, and we'll have a guest next week as well. Thank you.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.